What is going on, guys? In today's video I will show you the best builds tier list in Path of Exile 2. So finally we got the new patch, and surprisingly enough only few builds got nerfed, and from 1 to 2 got buffed. So like per usual, I've gathered the top 30 most popular builds, and here they are ranked from worst to best. Mostly this patch was about improving different monsters and quality of life. However, we still got nerfs for the poison builds, then also warriors got a nerf but a slight buff at the same time. Then now finally all the cast on ignite, freeze and the shock builds also got a slight nerfed. So now they're not that broken anymore and much more. And before we begin, personally for me I love to create new and unique builds in Path of Exile 2. So when I heard that Book of Yug also features similar gameplay like adventure, combat, leveling up, treasure hunting, loot collecting in dungeons and many more things, then I just had to show it to you. So Book of Yug is a free-to-play anime-style 3D idle RPG game, with gorgeous waifus and dark theme exploration. Similar to PoE2, this game also has hundreds of pieces of equipment, bunch of levels and systems like the talent trees and the gear upgrades to keep you engaged. So when you're not playing PoE2, this is definitely the best game to relax in, while also at the same time being very interesting, interactive and engaging. On top of this, the game offers auto movement and skill casting plus various speed settings. Personally for me, the non-stop critical hits make the gameplay more engaging than other typical idle games. So Book of Yug is the best casual friendly game, and now is the perfect time to try it out. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description and don't miss out on this experience that you can enjoy anytime without stress. So let's start off in the D tier, and here in the first one we will place every single grenade build. So grenade Deadeye, gas grenade, gambling legionnaire and etc. These grenade builds were really nice when the game just released, and when no one knew what they were doing. However, with the time we just outgrew them, and even though they haven't been nerfed, there are just way better builds out there if we compare them to the rest of the setups. So this build is structured around detonating the gas grenade with a variety of detonator skills, such as explosive shot or explosive grenade, to create a screen-wide explosion that can one-shot massive amount of enemy groups. But the time it takes for those grenades to detonate, plus the specific way you have to play and shoot, is just not optimal for the endgame. Then next up we have the Ice Sorceress, and we will also place him in the D tier. This was one of the first ever truly broken builds, and now also one of the first builds that got nerfed completely to the ground. And since the first patch, nothing has changed, as it just takes way too long for the Ice Comet to explode, and the new damage and the timers are just not good enough. This build's main playstyle revolves around putting up a frost wall, and then blasting enemies with the Ice Comet. And as cold penetration and cold exposure work incredibly well together, so this build works great on big groups of enemies where we are simply using 2 skill combo, and then covering our entire screen with the frost projectiles that explode and do massive amounts of damage. And then for the last and final D tier build we have the Fireball Sorceress. This build's main idea is built around putting up a frost wall, and then blasting enemies with infinite amount of fireballs. Cold exposure in the combination with the fire skills is again very OP, and this build will work better as the Ice Sorceress because for one we are not using the slow comet skill, but also the fire effect and range for this setup is just much more spammier. Thus we can scale our DPS quite high with the right build. On top of this, we are going to be using nodes like the Scoring Winds, Constant Gale and many more to increase our cast speed and mana, so we could basically spam our frost walls and speed farm through every content. Then next we have C tier, and in the first one we will place the Lightning Acolyte of Chayula. Simply put, this setup is similar to the top tier Invoker build, just in a lesser ascendancy. Overall, this build will offer a unique playstyle focused on the lightning damage and the manipulation of the darkness powers. With the strong defensive capabilities of Embrace the Darkness as well as Life and Energy Shield Leech, the Acolyte of Chayula will offer a great set of tools for survival. But as far as his high damage goes, he still can't compete with the rest of the godlike builds, like the Flicker Strike or the Ice Strike, and much more. Then for the next C tier build we have the Ignite Warrior, and as I mentioned at the start, the Warrior class got a slight nerf to the Supercharge. However, at the same time they got a slight buff in regards to 15% better armor. So while the setup pretty much did not change since the previous tier list, it still went down 1 tier, as now warriors have way better setups. like the Ice Hammer of the Gods, the Totem Warrior, and much more. Overall, the Ignite build will scale fire from our attacks and target big enemy groups to then set them on fire and explode. On top of this, our Ignite effect does damage based on the size of the hit that has been generated. However, again, the Ignite effect just takes too long and its performance for the single target is lacking, so that's why he's in the C tier. Then for the next C tier build we have the Permafrost mercenary. This setup is very unique because we are going to be freezing enemies with the Permafrost bolts, which will give us frost fires, so then it will enable us to drop explosive grenades and then detonate them with explosive shots, which will do massive amounts of damage. This build is great against bosses and other large enemy groups, as we can CC the enemy while our fuse is going on, and then we can detonate our AoE skills, which will see a huge explosion. This setup is similar to the grenade build, just with the extra CC element, and thus making your fights against bosses much easier. Then for one of the last C tier builds we have the Demon Witch. This setup's main focus is to scale fire from our attacks and then target big enemy groups, to then set them on fire and explode. We are going to be taking advantage of the seemingly limitless power scaling of the demon and the massive damage of the fire skills. You will start all the maps in the demon form and kill enemies, while its effect ramps up to 70 to 100 stacks, which when we disable the form and instantly reapply it, it will start the demon flame ramp all over again. However, the big downside of this is the time we are needing to constantly build up the stacks, and the demon form itself will not scale with our weapon. So this extra time wasted plus no need of a weapon makes this build just lack in DPS if we compare it against the other similar setups. And then for the last and final C tier build we have the Bonestorm Witch. This setup is structured around the skill Bonestorm, which by itself is a slow clearing ability, but with the right gems, passives and synergies, we can make it much better. And this is exactly what we have right here. This build also has two variants, so going full crit chance what I personally use for myself, or perhaps go with the detonated dead variant. Both of these will excel at different things, so which one you choose is up to you. The full crit chance setup will excel at huge amount of damage. We won't be focusing on anything else besides the massive crits and stacking as much life as possible, because the more life we have, the more damage we can do in return. Then next up we have the B tier, and the first one that we will place in here is the Poisonus concoction. This build has been nerfed and it was very popular because of how easy and cheap it is to get it, and also it scales the poison damage from the Poisonus concoction, so you would not need to worry about having the perfect damage uptime. The poison would just take care of that by itself. Your main gameplay loop will revolve around just running around in a map and using anything more than just the Poisonus concoction. Most enemies will die very fast because of the poison that gets spread through them from the contagious contamination. And in situations where the pack size is high, then you can even use the contagion to spread the poison in even bigger area. So as you can tell, this is a very spammy build. Then next up we have the Poison Mercenary. This build was nerfed in the previous patch, however in this one we got a slight buff, in the form of the Scavenge Planning stacks. This setup is known as the Toxic Poison build, where we are going to be dealing damage with just the poison effects alone. Our playstyle is structured around specializing in dealing damage, almost exclusively by the Plague Barrier, Gas Arrow and the Sniper. However, what I really like about this build is the fast speed farming potential, as you can keep moving while dealing insane amount of AoE damage. And then for rares and bosses, we will use the Plague Barrier and the Snipe, that will turn everything into a dust and make the fight super fun. Then for the next B tier build we have the Corrupting Cry Warrior. This build is pretty much a big AoV warrior that focuses on armor breaking offensively, and then the block defensively. Our main playstyle will revolve around using the Stampede skill, which will charge our character forwards and create patches of the jagged ground, which then are exploded when the final slam portion of the ability is executed. So we will be able to basically one-shot huge amount of grouped up enemies. And on top of this, you want to invest into the Giant's Blood Keystone, which will unlock the ability for us to use the two-handed weapon in just one hand, so then we could use a shield on our offhand. However, maces got a nerf, so you need to look for other weapons that will work as well. Then for the next B tier we have the Totem Warrior build. This is the best warrior build by far. This setup's main focus is to run and press from 1 to 2 skills, and target big enemy groups to then weaken them and explode. One of the most powerful skills that we have in our arsenal is the Shockwave Totem, which does incredible amount of AoE damage, and as you can see from the gameplay, we are just running into the enemies and one-shotting them without even trying. Also, our Ancestral Warrior Totem and the Scavenge Planning makes the most out of this, by effectively extending the damage of our hits many times over, in order to eliminate big targets like the bosses or tanky rare monsters. Then next we have the Explosive Shot Ranger, and both of these builds will deserve to be in the B tier. This build is structured around using Explosive Shot, which will proc bunch of buffs like the Herald of the Thunder, Herald of the Ice and Herald of the Ash, which will all create massive explosions and give you the ability to clear entire screens of the enemies in just a second or two. But as we will lack in single target damage, so for that reason we are also going to be using the Shock Burst rounds that will delete bosses insanely quickly. However, because of this we will now have to use the Tree Dragon Mask, which will now make our explosive shots contribute to the shock instead of ignite. And this will completely solve our low single target damage and make our build not only great for AoE, but also against tough bosses. Then next up in the B tier we have the Galvanic Shards Mercenary. This setup's main focus is built around the Galvanic Shards and the Shock Burst rounds that both act as a shotgun skill, which as you can see from the gameplay, can melt a ton of enemies in split seconds. Our playstyle is built around the Shock and the Chain Lightning, as Galvanic Shards have an amazing clear speed coming from the chains. The Shock Burst rounds have insane single target damage but require shock, so that's why we are constantly using the Stormcaller Arrow to get that crazy AoE buff and much more. Then for the next B tier build we have the Hexblast, which this is structured around using the Hexblast in the combination with other chaos skills that will curse and explode enemies in very wide area. Overall the Hexblast has a quite high mana cost, and that's why to make it efficient we are going to be using the Mask of the Sanguimancer, which will give us blood magic and increase critical hit chance. So now we can convert mana cost into life. On top of this, when possible, we can also utilize the Asterisk Gloves, so then this combination would completely remove the mana from the equation and give us the ability to infinitely spam the Hexblast and do massive amounts of damage without worrying about anything. The main gameplay idea behind our setup is just to one-shot most enemies, and as they will die, they will continuously replenish our life and energy shield. And now for the last and final B tier build we have the Hammer of the Gods. This setup is more known as the Ice Hammer build, where we are going to be smashing through enemies mainly by using the Stampede, in the combination with the Hammer of the Gods for AoE and Air Chatter for single target DPS. By using Devastate and Armor Explosion support gems, we are going to be doing these massive explosions and smashing everything and everyone that stands in our way. And by using this with the Surrender, it will transform us into a god that is virtually unkillable if you get overwhelmed by hundreds of enemies. Next up we have the A tier, and for the first one we have the Tempest Flurry build. This setup is also more known as the Stat Stacker. Our main goal is to stack as much strength, dexterity and intelligence as possible, to then scale it with our unique items such as Pillar of the Cage God and the Hand of the Wisdom in Action. One of the best things about our setup is that all it needs to function at the start is the Pillar of the Cage God, which is pretty affordable on a budget, but then later on we can scale it incredibly high with a massive power upgrade. Our main playstyle will revolve around using the Tempest Fury in the combination with the Charge Staff that can hit multiple times and create lightning shockwaves that, as you can see, will destroy enemies in split seconds. Then for the next A tier build we have the Blink Lightning Sorceress. This should not be a surprise to anyone, but the Temporalis body armor can no longer reduce cooldowns of a skill below 100 ms, so this pretty much nerfed most spam blink builds. This is not a complete nerf, so they're still good, but you just can't spam them that easily. This setup is the original Spark build with a blink and few more changes, and our main Spark damage will mainly scale up from the projectile size, their speed and duration, so we will build upon these three things to create a screen-wide electricity, which also thanks to the Archmage and the Constant Gale will enable us to upgrade our mana into giving us more damage and defenses at the same time. On top of this, all the other sorceress builds usually have mana issues. However, as you can see from the gameplay, we are barely losing any of it, because of our specific items and passives like the Force of Will, Mana on Kill and etc. Then for the next A tier build we have the Frost Mage, which this build utilizes the Skeletal Frost Mages by buffing them insanely high, so then we can do huge amount of damage in return. They also will freeze enemies and bosses, so most of the hard content will be like a walk in the park. This build's greatest strength is its primary defense, so we will have a massive amount of energy shield, and by using the Grim Feast we will double it, so in the endgame we will be able to reach up to 30,000 energy shields. On top of this setup's playstyle will allow you to clear quite aggressively, while still being able to pull back and let your minions protect you from the enemies whenever needed. And then for the last and final A tier build we have the Shattering Concoction Ranger. This setup pretty much just runs insanely fast and shows out freeze bottles at your enemies that explode through hundreds of targets. We are going to be doing about 5 million DPS with a fully maximized gear, and we are also going to be able to permafreeze mobs and pinnacle bosses, which will give us a very easy playstyle, as we won't have to worry about the enemies too much. Also, for our defense, we are stacking as much energy shield as possible, which will give us anywhere from 8 to 15,000 shields. Next we have S tier, and for the first one we got our good old Flicker Strike. This build focuses on the Flicker Strike, which generates massive amounts of frenzy charges from combat frenzy by freezing and electrocuting enemies, which when we can further convert the power charges with our Resonance Keystone, every time we have the power charges we spend them on the Flicker Strike to basically fly through the multiple screens of enemies like you can see from the gameplay. Then for the next S tier build we have the Skeletal Sniper Witch. This build as all witches got a slight buff to all minions. This setup is known as the Detonate the Dead minion build, that mainly uses Skeletal Arsonist for both AoE and single target damage, while then further increasing our DPS by casting Detonate the Dead, which explodes dead enemy corpses and lets us speed farm every single content in the game. This build is the best of both worlds because it combines very quick clearing speed with aggressive playstyle, while also having minions that protect you, and at the end game we will be able to reach from 15 to 13,000 energy shield, which basically will turn us into an unstoppable puppet master. Next up we have the Ice Chuck, which is also in the S tier. This setup's main focus is to lock down your enemies with quick freezes that last a long time. Even bosses are vulnerable to being frozen, and we can just lay down insane amount of DPS while they're stuck doing absolutely no damage. Your main gameplay will revolve around using the Ice Strike to close the gap between the enemies, then drop the Tempest belt to help you do more damage, and then activate your charge staff and the Shattering palm to engage the ranged enemies before they can even hit you, or just to completely melt them down in a second. Then for the next S tier build we have the Spirit Minion Witch build. This setup summons a Raging Spirit by casting the Flame Wall for offense, and then also for defense we get to command a minion army. So unlike most other setups where we are just only commanding or casting spells, well in this one we get to do both, and thus increase our DPS even higher. By using specific gear and building our skill tree around the nodes like the Power of the Dead, Fear the Dead, Silent Guard and many more, it will enable us to upgrade our minions and projectile area and damage. Then for one of the last S tier builds we got the Spark Sorceress. This setup is super fun and has insane amount of lightning damage. Also, as you can see, it is one of the most visually impressive builds in the game, as the Sorceress paralyzes and destroys monsters with a barrage of lightning. The Archmage with the Lightning Conduit and the Spark skill together will make up the bulk of our insane DPS. And at some point in the later game, some lowered gear players might run into a mana problem. But lucky for us, the Sorceress has many tools to address this problem, and with optimized gear we need nothing more than a single stat roll on our weapon or the gear to completely solve this issue. Then for the next S tier build we have the Lightning Arrow Ranger. This build is currently one of the best and fastest setups that you can use to farm maps and other endgame content. Like you can see from the gameplay, we are basically deleting enemies in split seconds. And on top of this, we can also delete bosses by having also a very high boss damage, by using the Cast on Shock and the Ball Lightning. And finally, for the last S tier build we have the Ice Shot Ranger. This setup uses an Ice Shot in the combination with the Lightning Rod and a Blink, which will give us this insane mobility and speed farming potential. What I like most about this setup is that we can simply spam one single skill, and pretty much destroy tier 16 maps and reach up to 5 million DPS, because of how many buffs we have working in the background. Like you can see from the gameplay, we are basically deleting enemies in split seconds. And on top of this, we can also delete bosses by us having a very high single target damage by using the Lightning Rod and the Orb of Storms.